everyone. Good evening. Boirun. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome. It's so good to have you all with us tonight for a wonderful new series on the Jews of Monastir with our dear friend Mark Cohen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic communities of the United States. We're so glad to have you here through our wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy, a host of online digital programming we've done through the past 10 months of the pandemic that have hosted wonderful new classes on Torah, Sephardic perspectives on halakha and history, culture, Ladino language, and of course, Sephardic cooking. We're here today in partnership with our dear friends at the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst. Now, welcome first Rabbi Stephen Golden, our dear friend, to say a few words of welcome and greetings. Rabbi Golden, if you can unmute, please, whenever you're ready.
Shalom. Thank you so much, Ethan. And just briefly, the Sephardic Temple, the leadership and the clergy is so proud to be able to be involved in this program hosted as well by the Sephardic Brotherhood. I know that Rabbi Marin's of blessed memory would have enthusiastically supported this event with Mark Cohen, as his relationship with Mark's father Saul is so beautiful and long-ranging. And I know that Rabbi Marin's delighted in the book. When I first came aboard 8 years ago, he immediately took it off his shelf and he said, "This is the book." And so I'm sure that while his name appears in the acknowledgments, I know that he must have really showered Mark with a lot of, regaled him with many stories and bits of information that made its way into his research in the book. So again, the Sephardic Temple is so proud to be able to co-sponsor this event tonight and for the following 2 Thursday evenings. So we wish that everyone should enjoy, and also tell your friends and family who aren't here this evening that they should come the next 2 sessions, and I'm sure there'll be a recording of this session so that they can catch up. So thank you very much for inviting us to be a part of this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Golden, for your kind words. Thank you so much as well, to the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst for partnering with us with this wonderful program, celebrating the Jewish history of the Monastery, of the Monastery Jews. A few words now about our wonderful speaker this evening, someone who's certainly a well-versed and frankly one of the leading scholars on the Jews of Monastir, who's written one of the wonderful books about the community, Mark Cohen. He wrote the last century of the Sephardic community, the Jews of Monastir, 1839 to 1943 in 2003, and was originally published through the Foundation for the Advancement of Sephardic Studies and Culture. A little bit about the book. It was 1839, a time when European ideas on education, fashion, entertainment, and politics were infiltrating every aspect of life in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Sephardim, descendants of the Spanish Jews exiled in 1492, were about to undergo vast changes in their education, outlook, and family life. In Monastir, a series of fires initiated these changes early and dramatically. A century later, in 1939, the Second World War began and the Monastir Jews faced extinction. Last century of the Sephardic community, the Jews of Monastir, 1839 to 1943, is the first book to tell this dramatic story. It also presents, for the first time, rare photographs and illustrations, original translations of Monastir's Sephardic folklore, and a complete listing of the Monastir Jews who were deported to the Treblinka concentration camp. Mark Cohen himself has written this book and numerous other books in his time as an author, community activist, and many other articles in literature on short stories. Without further ado, I invite Mark to unmute and begin the program. Mark, whenever you are ready.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Rabbi. It's a dubious distinction to be the expert on the Monastir Jews. It's a very small part of Monastir, of all of Sephardic Jewry, but it turned out to be very fortunate for me that my nonna was from Monastir when I decided to write this book, because Monastir turned out to be a perfectly representative community that through which you could learn nearly everything you could want to find out about the experience of all the Sephardim of the Balkans and what became Turkey during this last century of existence. Monastir went through all the changes that affected the Sephardim from the Balkans all the way east as well. So today's talk is the first of a series of 3 that'll be covering this last century. And this talk covers a period from 1839 to 1863. It's a period bracketed by 2 tremendous fires in the city. One was in 1835, after which the Ottoman authorities rebuilt the city into a modern city based on the ideas at the time about what an Ottoman city should be. And then a fire in 1863, which destroyed the Jewish quarter of the city and radically changed Jewish life in the city. And that is the story we'll hear today about what happened during that 1839 or 1835 to 1863 period. And the unusual story that many people don't think about, I certainly never did when I began this research, that the Sephardim of the Ottoman Empire were often in close contact with the Jews of Western Europe. And the Jews of Western Europe made their preferences known to the Sephardim about what kind of communities and what kind of changes they'd like to see the Sephardim make. And one of the techniques involved was financial pressure. And we're going to see that in this talk today. So to begin with the city of Monastir, we'll begin with this wonderful anecdote of a traveler who visited Monastir in 1848. He was the poet and landscape painter Edward Lear, famous for his nonsense rhymes, The Owl and the Pussycat, and other writings. And he spent 4 days traveling overland from Salonika to Monastir. Nearly all the towns he encountered along the way were tattered and dirty. They were no preparation for Monastir, as he wrote in his journal on September 17th, 1848. Anticipating, as in every previous case during this journey, that the glitter and outward appearance would be exchanged on entering the city for squalor and dreariness, I was agreeably surprised at the great extent of public buildings and offices at the entrance of the town, and within it at the width and good pavement of the streets, the cleanliness and neatness of the houses. The bustle and brilliancy of Monastir is remarkable. You are bewildered by the sudden reappearance of a civilization which you had apparently left forever. Bands of music, pashas, palaces, bustling scenes, and heaps of merchandise await you at every turn. If only a visitor to the streets of New York could say the same today, right? In the middle of the 19th century, Monastir was an oasis of Western civilization in the Ottoman Empire. From 1839 to 1863, the Ottoman Empire at large endured war and economic decline. But Monastir enjoyed 25 years of peace and prosperity. It was never on a par with the great Ottoman cities of Istanbul and Izmir, but during the 1840s and 1850s, it did nearly match Salonika in size and surpassed it in modern attainments. And in its, well, what do we got there, Ethan? There we go. There's a map showing where Monastir is in relation to Salonika and current day Greece. And the next map gives you an even better look. At the bottom of your screen is Monastir, Salonika. This is a map showing the rail links, which did not yet exist at the time that I'm talking about, but did at the end of the 19th century. And Monastir, as you can see, was very close to Albania as well. So there was a lot of Albanian influence on top of everything. So it was in a remote mountainous area in Macedonia, and it was separated from its regional metropolis of Salonika by 4 days on horseback. It nevertheless managed to grow into an affluent and energetic city of 45,000 people, and this population included 22,000 Muslims, 17,000 members of the Greek Orthodox Church, 2,000 Gypsies, 1,500 Roman Catholics, and 3,000 Jews. Monastir was an ideal Turkish city of the westernizing movement that the Ottoman Empire had embarked upon during the mid-19th century, which it called the Tanzimat. This was a program to increase the wealth and the strength of the empire by imposing on it, quote, the practices and procedures derived from Europe. And the whole of this program was in evidence at Monastir. Maybe we can go to a landscape picture of Monastir. Ethan? There we go. That's a nice picture of Monastir. It's a watercolor from 1860. And you can really get a sense of the mountains in the distance, the river that ran through the town, the good repair of the new buildings at the time. All the visitors to Monastir talked about the beauty of the setting and the beauty of the city. So the empire was faced with enormous challenges from Europe at the time. It was trying to modernize and westernize itself to compete properly in trade and also in military power. And by 1839, 4 years after a terrible fire in 1835, the city of Monastir had its streets widened, homes were updated, a barracks and military hospital were built. And in November of 1839, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire announced the first of the reforms, which signaled that non-Muslim subjects of the empire would have somewhat equal treatment. And before we're too judgmental, keep in mind that in 1839, the United States of America still had slavery. So this was an impressive move by the Ottoman Empire in 1839. And the city of Monastir announced through its new architecture, new streets, and new military barracks that travelers from Salonika who arrived and saw all this, they were arriving in one of the new cities of the empire and a city of the future. Now, alongside this embrace of European achievements and attainments, Monastir's Jewish quarter was a world apart. Let's go to the next drawing of Monastir from 1848. Ethan? Yeah, this is the 1848. You can see the clock tower. You can see the minaret and dome of one of Monastir's more famous mosques. And then in the next photograph, which is also, this happens to be near the Jewish quarter because the painter, Edward Lear, in his journals, said that the Jewish quarter was near the river where the water was not channeled by a new wall and new channeling measures. So Lear found it very picturesque, but it's interesting to note that the Ottoman government decided that the improvements to the town did not need to extend into the Jewish quarter. So it had a ramshackle appearance even at the height of its power. And in the Jewish quarter, coincident with a kind of benign neglect on the part of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews of Monastir lived a still largely very traditional life. Medieval Spanish ballads that were forgotten in other Ottoman Sephardic communities were still sung in Monastir. The pronunciation of Ladino in the town was especially antique. Women who could not read recited long and complex folk tales from memory, and hundreds of proverbs that shrewdly and comically located life's truths were a common possession. And one of my favorite of those Sephardic proverbs is Dil Dio y dil vecino no se puede nada encubrir. From God and from the neighbor, one can't hide anything. I love that. I love that proverb. And one of the reasons that life remained so traditional in the Jewish quarter was that the Ottoman government made no attempt to urge the Jews toward modern schooling. The government made modern schooling an imperative for the empire's Muslims, especially its army. And the empire benefited from the European orientation of its 2 million ethnic Greeks and its 2.5 million Armenians, who, as Christians with large merchant classes, had a natural affinity with Christian Europe. But neither force was at work among the Jews. The government did not pressure them to learn French or other secular subjects because the Jews' small numbers, there were only 150,000 Sephardim in the whole Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century. And the Sephardim had no natural sympathy with Christian Europe. So unlike the Muslims and the Christians, the Jews were neither pushed nor pulled toward Europe. And the education system for the Monastir Jews was entirely traditional. Girls stayed at home and received an education through Sephardic folk culture alongside their mothers, where they learned to cook, bake, cheese was made at home, bread was made at home, wine was made at home, everything was made at home. And Monastir's Jewish boys attended a nursery school known as La Skolika, which was run by a woman. It was kind of a nursery school. The woman was known as La Maestra. And there they learned the beginning of songs and prayers. And then the schooling continued in the Talmud Torah, where students mastered the Hebrew alphabet and learned the Torah and how to translate it into Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, so that the stories and lessons could be understood. No secular studies were offered, no math, no history, no Western languages. The purpose of the Talmud Torah was to instill Jewish faith and guarantee the existence and continuance of the Jewish people. And it provided the only education that Jewish boys received. The chink in the armor of this traditional life was poverty. The poverty that was extant throughout the Ottoman Sephardic world threatened the Ottoman Sephardim with the collapse of their societies. And this was the case in Monastir as it was everywhere in the Ottoman Empire. And from Monastir, we have wonderful sources. The Church of Scotland in 1863 sent a missionary to the Jews of Monastir. And this man, Charles Stober, got to Monastir in July 1863. And he wrote that about of the 600 families in the town, 300 families were doing well, but 200 were utterly destitute and dependent on charity for their survival. And in the Jewish quarter, he wrote, several families, sometimes as many as 5, were crowded into one house. Now, tradition's answer to the problem of poverty was tzedakah, charity. And by the mid-19th century, many poor Ottoman Sephardim and their schools and synagogues relied heavily on the support of a small class of wealthy Jews. In Monastir, affluent Jews were also crucial to the community's survival. And we have information from the British consulate in Monastir. The consul was a man named Charles Calvert, and he wrote to his superiors in London that the burden of Ottoman taxes on the Jewish community as a whole, not individuals. You didn't get a letter in the mail to your particular street address at home from the Ottoman government. The individual communities, Greek, Armenian, Jewish, were levied as a community a tax. And there were special onerous taxes on non-Muslim communities. That was part of the price of an unequal society at that time in an Islamic society. And Charles Calvert, the British consul, wrote, "The wealthier Jews supported the Monastir Jews by their united efforts, by which they have been relieved from the payment of the military exemption tax, as well as of nearly every other tax assessed upon their community." So the rich were paying the community's taxes and supporting the schools. Now, this tension between the westernization going on in the city at large and the traditional life being lived by the Jews in the quarter was especially keenly felt by the wealthier Jews in Monastir, who participated in both realms. They were members of the Jewish community, but of course their business depended on the trade that went on in Monastir at the main bazaar, and their ability to have, yes, let's go to that, please. And their ability to conduct trade and business. This is a very rare color photo of the Kal Aragon, the Aragon Community Synagogue in Monastir. This photo was taken in 1913, and it's a very obscure photo that I was able to find. And this was one of the older Sephardic synagogues in Monastir, centuries old by 1913 when this photo was taken. And you can see the paroquet, the curtain protecting the Torah, and there might be a little bima here. It's hard to make out much more. There seems to be some sort of image, perhaps here, of the Ten Commandments. It's very interesting. Just as a side note, I can't resist telling you this wonderful story. In the very early 20th century, a French Jewish banker, whose last name was Kahn, spent his entire fortune sending photographers around the world to photograph the last remnants of traditional life before the whole world would become westernized. And those photographers even went to Monastir and took photos there of the Jewish community. And I think the next photo of this is also from 1913. These are Jewish women in Monastir in 1913, and they're wearing headdresses that I'm sure, I would bet, are unknown to most of you. These headdresses were described by visitors to Monastir from the 1850s and 1860s as a huge and complex turban that the Jewish women wore. And these older women, who might be in their 70s or early 80s in 1913, who would have been girls in the 1860s or even earlier, 1850s, kept their traditional clothing. And it gives you an idea of the traditional life that existed at the period we're talking about. And you can see a little bit in this woman, there's a shiny copper golden braid there that I'm sure are what was called the ducados, the string of coins that women wore as a headdress, as a kind of jewelry. So these are wonderful and very unusual photos. So the wealthy in mid-19th century Monastir were very open and eager to find some solution to the terrible poverty of Monastir, which was their burden to bear for the entire community. And we know from another visitor to Monastir in 1860, the Church of Canada, of all places, sent a converted Jewish doctor as a missionary to the Jews of Monastir. And this Reverend Epstein got to Monastir in 1860, and he wrote letters back to the main office, which were published in the missionary newspaper where I found them. And in November of 1860, he wrote, "A school for boys and girls might perhaps succeed here more than any other agency. There is a desire on the part of some for educational privileges, and in a short time, the same may be begotten in others." And we also know that as early as 1857, Monastir's French Catholic Mission School, that was established by a group known as the Lazarus from Paris, included 2 Jewish girl students in the French Catholic Mission School in 1857. These admittedly are just scraps of evidence, but they point to 2 important conclusions. One is that by the early 1860s or the end of the 1850s, there were a few Monastir Jews who had begun to drift from traditional Jewish life. The other thing we know is that this trend was limited and not organized. That is, until the fire of 1863. At 4 p.m. on August 14th, 1863, after weeks of drought, guns were fired at the army barracks. It was a fire alarm. The blaze began in a small tavern and soon spread to nearby houses. In a letter dated August 20th, the British consul to Monastir wrote to London this description of the fire. The civil authorities, with the entire corps of local police and military, with several detachments of troops, each provided with fire engines and implements for pulling down wooden buildings, however early on the spot, were unable to check the spread of the flames. Owing to the recent drought, water was exceedingly scarce, and the little water that was available proved all but useless in the face of a conflagration which from the beginning possessed a character of irresistible ascendancy. You gotta love that writing. I mean, goodness, the literateness of mid-19th century British officials, I'm impressed. Monastir's Jewish quarter was the main victim of this fire. Of the 232 homes lost to the fire, 190 were in the Jewish quarter, while the Christian quarter lost 35 houses and the Turks only 7. The 190 lost homes represented more than 90% of the Jewish quarter, and the Jews' 6 synagogues and houses of study and the Talmud Torah school were also destroyed. For sympathetic observers on the scene, the destruction of Monastir's bazaar, bridges, and clock tower, which we saw in those earlier depictions, the bridges and clock tower, those were also lost. These losses paled in comparison to the human suffering inflicted on the Jews. And the British consul wrote to London on August 20th, quote, "The almost total destruction of their quarter has reduced upwards of 600 Jewish families to a state of great misery and destitution. Up to the present time, the government authorities have issued 1,000 loaves of bread a day, and another 1,000 have been provided by private contributions. This supply, however, barely suffices to keep the most necessitous from starvation. Others contrive for the present to live upon their own scanty resources, which must sooner or later be exhausted. But above all other considerations, anxiety for the future must predominate, since some kind of provision must be made, as well for housing and warming as for feeding these miserable people during the approaching winter. For the present, some hundreds of them are crowded together in tents provided by the government. Others live in the open air under trees, and as many as have been able to afford to pay rent have got into private houses." It's really very moving to read this at a time when our own country and world is going through a pandemic, and we're having debates about government help. And it's fascinating to realize that the idea of government aid for people who were not even considered citizens, they were merely subjects, was taken for granted even almost 200 years ago in the Ottoman Empire. The government gave food, and as it says here, the tents provided by the government. I found that really eye-opening. The Scottish missionary to the Jews, a Reverend Stober, not Epstein, but another one, was especially grieved by the Jews' predicament. And he wrote a letter which was published in the Church of Scotland Home and Foreign Missionary Record. It was published there in October 1863, and this is what he wrote to his readers. "I beg that you will make their case known to all friends of Israel, to all who have hearts to feel for the old people of God. Help, dear friends, help us soon, that these wretched people may get shelter and warm clothing before winter." It's really quite touching. These missionaries, who of course we're naturally inclined, and rightfully so, to think poorly of, in at least some cases, and obviously here, were genuinely concerned and moved at the predicament of the Jews in the town. Now, the heart of our story and the main help came from the Jews of Europe. The chief rabbi of Monastir, Rav Jacob Joseph Israel, along with other community leaders, wrote a letter to Sir Moses Montefiore of London. Moses Montefiore was, well, recently Sheldon Adelson died. Regardless of what we may think of him, an extraordinarily powerful player in the Jewish community worldwide, philanthropist, kingmaker in Israel. Montefiore was like a Ronald Lauder and a Sheldon Adelson and whoever else you can think of put together. He married into the Rothschild family. He was their private stockbroker. He lived to be 100. And during his lifetime, he set out on numerous special missions to help the Jews of Damascus, Morocco, Russia, Turkey, and Romania, and Jerusalem. Of course, this is long before air travel. such journeys were arduous and difficult. And Montefiore was known to the Ottoman Sephardim since at least 1840, when a blood libel against the Jews that was known as the Damascus Affair brought European Jews to the Ottoman Empire to intercede on the Sephardic Jews' behalf. And not only did he visit Istanbul in 1840, but he had been in Istanbul in May 1863, just a few months before the fire, to meet with the Sultan, and had received from the Sultan a proclamation assuring the Jews of equal rights in the empire. So he was top of mind when this tragedy hit. And the Jews wrote a letter to him, which was written and dated in Hebrew the 5th of the month of Elul, the year 5623, which corresponded to August 20th, 1863. The British consul in the city forwarded it to London with his own diplomatic papers. It reached London on September 17th, almost a month later. The letter was immediately sent to the Jewish Chronicle newspaper of London and printed in full on September 25th. And this is the letter as it appeared in translation in the newspaper. To Sir Moses Montefiore and company. After having invoked blessings on your head, we acquaint you that, alas, alas, a fire from heaven has visited our city and has consumed our beautiful synagogues and houses of study. And our young and old wander about the streets naked and in the greatest destitution, and women brought up delicately go about barefoot and without garments. The voice of the law is heard lamenting, because there is no place now for its study. We are all reduced to the greatest misery, for our beautiful city has become a prey to the flames. Only about 15 houses have escaped. And now, to whom are we to turn our eyes for help? But to our Father in heaven, who has pity on all his creatures, and to him who has been privileged to assist so many. We implore you to extend to us a helping hand and to speak to the chiefs and charitable of your city, that they may look upon us with benevolence and bestow upon us some of the blessings wherewith God has blessed them, and thus assist us in repairing the damage done. An extraordinary letter, extraordinary in the efficacy and the efficiency of the what was the equivalent of the Jewish Federation, which was called the Board of Deputies, still called the Board of Deputies in London, to receive the letter, forward it to Moses Montefiore, get it to the Jewish Chronicle, and in addition, in the September 25th issue of the Chronicle, that included the letter from Monastir, Moses Montefiore himself printed his own letter to the editor, which urged all of the Jews of the kingdom to contribute. And this is what he wrote, the letter from Monastir. My dear sir, I feel it is my duty, without one moment's delay, to call your attention to the accompanying letters describing the piteous calamity which has just befallen our brethren in Monastir. I feel assured that the Board of Deputies will hasten to make known the melancholy intelligence to the several synagogues in the kingdom, and request the authorities to cooperate in organizing a movement to mitigate, as far as in us lies, the dreadful distress of the helpless sufferers. And I would respectfully suggest that a stirring appeal be made by our reverend preachers on the approaching fast of atonement, Yom Kippur, by the grace of God, one might say, was the following week. On the approaching fast of atonement, and that special offerings be made in every synagogue on that solemn day, and surely an appeal in the house of God to our more prosperous brethren, never made in vain, will, on a day when charity, as set forth in our holy ritual, is regarded as one of the three pillars on which atonement rests. And of course, as we know in synagogue, repentance counts on tzedakah, tshuva, tefillah, charity, repentance, and prayer. And Moses Montefiore makes specific reference to that here. That this requirement be attended under God's blessing with the best and happiest results. I request you will be pleased to receive the enclosed 20 pounds, a contribution to the fund in memory of my deeply lamented wife, Judith Lady Montefiore. I remain, my dear sir, yours faithfully, Moses Montefiore. Well, all of London Jewry responded. On Yom Kippur, London's Jews learned of the fire and the homeless Jews of Monastir. Rabbis made speeches, announcements were posted, and the weekly Jewish Chronicle reported on the Monastir story for more than a month. At London's Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation, a special session of the Board of Elders was convened to approve the raising of money for Monastir on Yom Kippur. And in addition, the Board of Elders approved an immediate grant of 100 pounds from the Fund of Cautivos, which provided money to ransom captives and help victims of disasters. The pressure to donate, this is fascinating, the pressure to donate was so strong that the one London synagogue that did not make a contribution to Monastir was chastised in the pages of the Jewish Chronicle for, quote, its act of selfish indifference. The public shaming led the Bayswater Synagogue to make a donation. London's Jews raised 2,000 pounds toward the relief of the Jews of Monastir, which we can assume was a sizable amount. If Moses Montefiore gave 20 pounds, then 20 pounds had to be a respectable sum, or else it would have been embarrassing for him to make that gift publicly. He might have made an embarrassing gift privately, but surely not publicly. And the money was sent to Monastir through the offices of the British consul and purchased food, clothing, and shelter from Monastir's Jews. It was also used to rebuild the house of the chief rabbi. But London's Jews would not permit the community in Monastir to use the money to rebuild its synagogues and Talmud Torah school. For Monastir's Jews, the destruction of the synagogues was one of their chief losses that they mentioned in the letter to London. But London insisted the money be spent only on humanitarian relief. And why? Why did they do this? Well, since 1840, as I mentioned earlier, when leaders of French and British Jewry visited the Ottoman Empire and Egypt to help the Jews accused of killing a Christian boy for his blood, it was one of the first times that Western Jewry became acquainted with the Sephardim of the Ottoman Empire. And what they saw displeased them. The head of French Jewry, a man named Adolphe Crémieux, was in Egypt, and he delivered a sermon at a local synagogue that advocated teaching a European curriculum in schools. And he even founded schools in Cairo Jewish schools to teach non-Jewish secular subjects. They were the first such schools in the Ottoman Empire. They closed shortly after his departure back to France. And Moses Montefiore visited Istanbul and was disturbed to find that Sephardic schools focused solely on the study of Hebrew and the Talmud, which students translated into their native Judeo-Spanish. And Montefiore met with the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire, quote, rebuked them for their unwisdom in concentrating all their energies on the study of Hebrew, unquote, and pressed the rabbi to issue on October 28, 1840, a proclamation urging all Jewish schools in the empire to hire teachers of Turkish. And I'm going to tell you this now, although it may make some of you groan, and I apologize. I own a copy of this proclamation, and I neglected to photograph it so that you could see it, but I will photograph it so that it can be included in this talk when it's placed online. And it's wonderful to look at. Across the top, it's written in Ottoman Turkish, which back then was written in the Arabic alphabet. And then on two columns that look completely identical, there's Hebrew, and then again Hebrew, but Hebrew that sounds out Spanish. And if there are people who can read Hebrew, they will sound out words and realize they're speaking Spanish, they're Spanish words. Over the next 20 years, between 1840 and 1860, the Jews of Western Europe became more and more involved in the life of the Ottoman Sephardim. And by 1860, the Jews of Europe founded a group called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Worldwide Jewish Alliance. This was an educational organization founded in Paris in 1860 in order to raise money from philanthropists in Europe and membership dues from members worldwide to found schools for the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, and they did so. The first cities to have Alliance committees were Istanbul and Salonika and Izmir. And in 1864, Monastir opened one of the very first Alliance committees in the Ottoman Empire. And here's the list of the members of the committee. This list was printed in the Alliance's newsletter in January 1865, listing the members of 1864. One of the things that's interesting to note is the Sephardic names, Alevi, Kamai, Namias, Sarfati. Well, Sarfati is not exactly a real Sephardic name, because the first Jews in the Ottoman Empire to be attracted to the new Western European curriculum of the Jewish schools were very Europeanized Jews who did business in the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of these were known as Francos, and they were Frankified Jews of the Ottoman Empire. They weren't true Sephardim. So Sarfati means the French person, it could mean the Spaniard, but it often means the Frenchman. But names like Kami, Alevi, Namias are classic Sephardic names. And here where it says banker, merchant, banker, professor, teacher, there were no proper banks. These were moneylenders with offices, because the Jews didn't work in or own proper banks. But there were enough Jews interested to start this committee. Now, to go back to the rather desperate situation of the Monastir Jews and the really cold-blooded response of the Jews of London when it came to how the money should be spent, given the zeal for reform of the Sephardim's education system shown by the establishment of the Alliance 3 years before the fire, it's no surprise that London's Jews refused to help rebuild Monastir synagogues and Talmud Torah. But it is amazing to read some of the minutes of the meetings that were held in London. And one of them, on November 31st, 1863, one of the meetings was headed by Montefiore's nephew, Joseph Meyer. And the president of the Board of Deputies reported to the committee, quote, that he had received a letter from Monastir from Her Majesty's consul at Monastir, Mr. Calvert, dated October 22nd, as to the difficulty of organizing a committee of relief and as to the desire of the elders of the community to apply part of the subscriptions toward a building fund for the re-erection of synagogues and schools, but that in his opinion, the British consul's opinion, the whole of the subscription be applied for food, clothing, lodging for the destitute poor. The committee was of the same opinion, and Mr. Montefiore was empowered to write to Mr. Calvert to that effect. What's so revealing about this is how the much more assimilated, acculturated Jews of London felt that their worldview and the worldview of the Christian consul to Monastir were in agreement, but the views of the more traditional Jews of Monastir were not to their liking. The Jews of England had become very fully English. And this is an interesting moment that shows how their sympathies had become transformed or transferred to a new way of looking at Jewish life. So in July 1864, the Jews of Monastir formed the committee to found Alliance schools, as we've seen. And this committee was enormously important because it was the community's first formal break with traditional religious life and its institutions. The Alliance schools held out the promise of learning French and succeeding economically. By transferring their allegiance to the Alliance, the committee members revealed that a radical shift in values was in progress. A shift in values that all of us here today embody and represent as people who are committed to university education in the best colleges that we can gain entry to, and unfortunately, a great disregard for more traditional Jewish learning. The former has replaced the latter. London's actions made turning to the Alliance an economic necessity for Monastir's Jews. When Montefiore embraced Monastir's cause and inaugurated a fundraising campaign, he demonstrated that there was indeed money available, even for small communities such as Monastir. But when the Board of Deputies refused to fund the rebuilding of the Talmud Torah, it became clear that Monastir could lose funding opportunities if it did not develop acceptable institutions. The board's staunch refusal to fund traditional religious institutions was crippling the community's ability to function. London's tantalizingly close yet inaccessible funds brilliantly highlighted the need for Monastir to adopt new institutions such as the Alliance that were favored by European Jewry. Monastir's Alliance Committee over the next 60 years became one of the most important institutions for the Monastir Jews. Their relationship with Paris headquarters, the appearance in town of teachers, Jewish Sephardic teachers educated in Paris and sent back to the Sephardic communities, such as Monastir, the transformation of even the Talmud Torah school became part of the Alliance and introduced curriculum from the Alliance into the Talmud Torah school, completely revolutionized Jewish life in the city. London Jewry's, in closing, just to say that Montefiore and London, this is a wonderful photograph, also from 1913, of the boys' Alliance School in Monastir. And as you can see, the boys were all wearing the fez. And though we think of the fez as very traditional, the fez was introduced in order to replace the turban. So the fez was a modernizing innovation, not a traditional one. The traditional headdress was the turban, as you saw in those drawings from 1848. And you see here the teachers, the heads of the school. This, I'm pretty sure, is Rabbi Jane, who was a well-known rabbi in the community, who visited the United States in the very early 20th century to raise money for the Jews of Monastir. So in closing, Moses Montefiore and London Jewry's determination to shape the conditions that led to Monastir's first Alliance Committee provides a compact and dramatic example of how West European Jews introduced change into Ottoman Sephardic life in the 19th century. That's it. Thank you very much. More than happy to take any questions from anyone. I hope that was not too long and okay.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the wonderful first class in this three-part series. We'll have a few minutes just for some questions. If you have a question, I'll ask you please enter it into the chat. What you can do is open up the chat box, go to the bottom of your screen where the Zoom is, and click chat, and then just type it in, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. One question that already came up a bit earlier in the chat, Mark, to me personally, was a question about how the Jewish community of Monastir interacted with the Jewish communities of Salonika and other major hubs, where there are often correspondence, where there were responsum between the rabbis. What were the deep relationships that developed over time?
Well, there were certainly business relationships. Monastir was a very active and lively trade and business hub. And the Jewish merchants in the town would have, by necessity, had dealings with the Jewish merchants in Salonika. As for responsa, that was unfortunately beyond my capability to research. I'm sure there were questions and answers sent between the rabbis of Salonika and Monastir, dealing with all sorts of ritual questions: marriage, divorce, kashrut, synagogues, etc., etc. There's no doubt that that was the case. I'd be skeptical of how much correspondence took place between Monastir and Istanbul or Izmir. Salonika was more than big enough, and over the 19th century and early 20th century became even bigger and bigger, until it became quite a major Jewish community of, I think, almost 100,000 Jews. Whereas the community of Monastir topped out in the early 20th century at around 10 or 11,000 Jews. But I really can't shed a whole lot of light on that. We should keep in mind that the journey from Monastir to Salonika was not easy. A railroad did not link the cities until 1894. And during the wintertime, and though we think of this as the Mediterranean, Monastir was inland and in the mountains. And Monastir got snow in the winter, heavy snows. And there are many travel accounts of how difficult it was to travel on the dirt roads during rain and snow seasons from Monastir to Salonika. So for months at a time, Monastir was fairly cut off from Salonika. But in addition to the north-south traffic that linked it to Salonika, Monastir also did business on the east-west traffic from Albania, Ottoman Albania, through to one of the major cities, forgetting now, in what became Serbia. So it was at a crossroads, north, south, and east, west. It's kind of like putting a shopping mall at the intersection of major highways, one going north and the other going west. It was a major stopping point.
Question here. We're getting a lot of nice questions. Was Monastir / Bitola, as it's known today, a center for publishing?
No, there doesn't seem to have ever been a Jewish newspaper in Monastir. I have not found any evidence that there was ever a Ladino newspaper in Monastir. Salonika had several. And in fact, Jewish journalism in the Ottoman Empire began with the Damascus affair of 1840. That was the beginning of covering the Sephardic community by Sephardim to keep track of what was going on in their community and their ties with Jewry outside the empire. So there were many newspapers in Salonika, Izmir, Istanbul, of course, that were written with Hebrew characters that, when were read, represented largely a Spanish vocabulary. But no. As I said, the whole community of Jews at its height was about, if I'm remembering correctly, 10 to 11,000. It might have been 12,000, but it really wasn't large enough to support a newspaper. And I'm sure, talking about the Salonika connection, that newspapers were delivered from Salonika to Monastir. It just stands to reason that they would be. There are reports from the pre-railroad days of the mule trains and even camel trains of pack animals that would bring goods from Salonika to Monastir. And enormous amounts of weight were able to be brought, with trains of animals 500 or even 1,000 long. And these animals would carry enormous weight. Hundreds of tons of goods and merchandise were brought from Salonika to Monastir on these caravans. So we shouldn't underestimate. It wasn't three guys with a pack on their back. It was much larger scale than that, more sophisticated.
A question here that popped up a few times, which I find interesting. Someone asked that they got the sense that the well-to-do London Ashkenazic Jews kind of looked down on the Monastery's Jews as being culturally or intellectually inferior. One person here actually described it as a form of Orientalism. They're curious to hear your comment and your take on that.
Well, that's not false. Yeah, that's true. And part of the incentive for European Jews to improve the lot of the Sephardic Jews was that as Europe expanded into the Near East, France taking over parts of North Africa, consuls opening in cities across the Ottoman Empire, newspaper publications, as the Jews became more and more familiar with the condition of the Sephardim in the Ottoman Empire, it became an embarrassment for the assimilated Jews of the Ottoman Empire to see the condition that the Sephardim were living in. It's probably not that different from the way some of us might feel about the ultra-Orthodox Haredim in Brooklyn or parts of Jerusalem. And we think to ourselves, how could these people be living like that? Well, it was largely the same phenomenon. The British and French Jews were speaking French and speaking English in their home countries and dressing like their countrymen. And the Jews of the Ottoman Empire were speaking a different language, written in a different alphabet. And the whole structure of life in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews in the West did not understand the world that the Sephardim were living in. Comparing France and England to the Ottoman Empire was a mistake. They were not analogous situations. And regardless of the reforms the Ottoman Empire undertook in order to bring about equality of citizenship, let's say, between Jews and Christians on the one hand and Muslims on the other, never really succeeded. You couldn't be a Turk or an Ottoman without being Muslim. It made no sense. And as some of you may know, you to be Greek without being a member of the Greek Orthodox Church is a contradiction in terms. These are things that go together. So the expectation that the Ottoman Empire would become like France, a fiercely secular state where religion and the state were completely at odds with one another, that was never going to happen, as we've seen, as history has proved over the last 2 centuries, in the Islamic world. It still hasn't happened. And it doesn't happen in a lot of European countries, as we discussed. In Eastern Europe, the Eastern Orthodox churches of Bulgaria or Greece or the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, these go hand in hand with the ethnic nationality of those countries. So there was a misunderstanding, and the kind of hopes that the British and French Jews had for the Ottoman Sephardim and what they could eventually achieve by learning Turkish and being accepted as Turks was impossible. But they could not have known that. It was unknowable at the time. I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight, but that's what they were hoping. And it was a worthwhile hope because the Jews were official second-class citizens in the Islamic Empire. So the idea that they might be granted equal rights, enfranchisement, was obviously something to hope for. But the Ottoman Jews themselves realized that their development was going to be different than that of Western Europe. But the Alliance schools, I don't want to make it seem, at first, in the very, very beginning, they were more or less forced down the throats of the Ottoman Sephardim. But the answers they provided to the problem of poverty were so important, they were irresistible. And the Jews of the Ottoman Empire and all the communities formed very close relationships with the Alliance. And the Alliance became one of the most important, it became almost like a government in exile of the Jews of the Ottoman Empire. It was the first recourse for help, for advice, for schooling. The Jews had their own school system. They weren't going to go to Islamic schools. There was no common school system. There was no secular Ottoman school system the Jews could attend. It wasn't what we think of with our American experience. It was not that kind of experience. I hope that answers.
We have time for one last question here. It's kind of a two-parter. One, how many synagogues were there actually, do we estimate, in Monastir? And second, you mentioned the Aragon Synagogue. Do we know for certain, based on documentation, that the Jews of Monastir were exclusively from Aragon in Spain, or was it other parts as well?
The two main synagogues in Monastir were Cal Aragon and Cal Portugal. So I think actually this kind of handed down knowledge or familiarity, I think it's actually fairly reliable. That once a name was given to a particular synagogue at a particular date in history that's untraceable, that there must have been a fairly good reason for it. And how many synagogues? We know from before 1863 in the fire, from the Consul Calvert's letter, that 6 synagogues and houses of study were destroyed. So there were 6. By the early 20th century, in my book, I have the exact number. I think it might have been closer to 10. And in one of the sources I recall, my book came out 17 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. But in one of the sources, I remember that a traveler recounted visiting one of the synagogues and was shown as one of the great treasures of the Jewish community, either a book or more likely a Torah scroll that was said to have been brought with them from Spain. What happened to this is unknowable. The other thing about records is that the same thing I said about there being no general schools for citizens or subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the same goes for records. The Ottoman Empire did not keep records on what was happening in the Jewish community, who was born, who died. You didn't have to go to City Hall for a license to open a store or a permit. So the Jewish community and the Christian community more or less functioned independently without much government oversight. You just had to obviously obey the law and pay your taxes. And then you could do more or less what you wanted. Everyone was free to live as a Jew. It wasn't like in some places in Europe at certain times where even living as a Jew was dangerous. It was not dangerous to live as a Jew in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't dangerous to live as a Christian in the Ottoman Empire. These things only became a problem with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of states. And the states, whether it was Bulgaria or Greece or Turkey, became ethnic states. And then the Jews had a problem because they didn't fit as Greeks, and they didn't fit as Turks, and they didn't fit as Bulgarians. And suddenly there was no place for them. The empire was roomy in that way. You didn't have equal rights, but everyone was a subject. So that was not a really big deal. But once nations were formed according to religion, language, and ethnicity, then the Jews found themselves homeless. There was no state they could belong to naturally when the Ottoman Empire fell apart and little states, or in the case of Turkey, big states, replaced it. I wish we had time for more questions because I love questions. I love answering questions. But if Ethan says we got to go, we got to go.
I do want to respect the time frame that we do have. And I want to thank Mark so much for the time this evening and all of your wonderful questions. If we do have some other ones, I'll be happy to share them with him as well and see if he can get back to you. Is that okay, Mark, if I send them along to you?
Sure.
Great. With that, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us for part 1. Just as a reminder, if you missed any portion of this class or any other classes, you can always go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sephardic Brotherhood to rewatch it and share it with your friends and family who'd like to see it as well. Additionally, I encourage you all to check out all our other additional programs on our website, SephardicBrotherhood.com. With that, I want to wish you all a nochava buena, a good evening. Thank you again to the Sephardic Temple of Cedarhurst as well for co-sponsoring this event. And thank you, Mark, for the wonderful part in our three-part series. We'll see you all back to Keradlio, inshallah, next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Thank you all so much.